Hey guys, welcome back. It's the next video update, and it's interesting what's happening, obviously in US and Europe. There's a lot going on to talk about, but just as far as cases go, seems like it's slowed down quite a bit, and so people have kind of forgotten and obviously kind of dismissed it. And so this is the problem when you're not looking ahead of the curve, is you kind of just reacting to events. And so now everyone's obviously caught up with all the rioting and all that stuff going on, which does have some impacts, obviously, if you're living in these places. But as far as the case count, if you remember back to when this started, obviously in China, the next country to be hit was Iran. So this is really one that's worth watching. Obviously, the cases in China don't really make a lot of sense. I've always kind of said we can't really trust the numbers there. People said the same thing about Iran, obviously, when it broke out there, that it was suppressed for a long time. There wasn't a lot of testing, and so they were downplaying the numbers. And I think what's interesting now is that obviously they were one of the first ones to have that first wave, and so you can actually on Google now it'll pull the numbers off Wikipedia, and you can actually get an idea of the trends here. So you can type in any country, and I'll go through a few here and just give you some examples. But you can actually see that Iran has kind of picked up since the beginning of May, and it's actually heading back towards the previous highs. So people are not really looking to see what's coming. But actually, this kind of shows, this isn't over really by any stretch. And so, yeah, as of yesterday, 1st of June, we're almost back to the highs. And you can say there's probably is more testing going on now. So maybe this isn't quite as bad as it was back then in terms of reality on the ground. But just looking at the actual numbers picking up, despite the increased testing, shows you that this virus hasn't gone away. And if we do see a second wave here, it's going to be probably much bigger than the first one. So that's just generally how this has played out in the past. If you look at Spanish flu and other sort of outbreaks. And we could see some interesting triggers like solar flares and other events that cause viral mutations. So I've shared some stuff on this on my Facebook. If you guys look, and I'll go through some of those posts as well in a minute. But it's just interesting to see that maybe Iran is a more useful indicator because they don't really have any incentives to sort of hide the same way that China is sort of, fudging their reporting. So obviously China wants to make it look like they're in control and they didn't start this virus. And so there's a lot of propaganda going on there. But if you look at Iran, it's really picking up. And so you can expect, again, the other countries to kind of follow, in a similar delay to the first wave, especially once lockdowns have ended. With all the rioting and protests going on in the US, that's like a really potentially big spreading event, all these people running around. It's like the optimal environments for a virus to spread if you think that's how it's being spread. So Iran's interesting, and some of the other countries, like in South America, it's just they're still in their sort of wave one, but you can see you've had this kind of big growth. This is obviously lagging by a couple of days, but if you look at just the general trend, you have these just absolutely crazy first wave counts. They're adding up to 33,000 cases a day. And you look at other countries like Peru's another one, very similar, just taking off here. So these are obviously countries where, they haven't got as very good healthcare, medical care, or preventions or lockdowns. In some places, they're quite extreme with lockdowns, but they just don't have the general tracking, testing, capabilities that developed countries do. So you can expect to see the first waves to be, less stunted and just kind of play out. So, and for healthcare facilities kind of be overwhelmed and not have the capacity. So Ecuador was quite a bad one initially, but these other countries, I don't know how Ecuador's doing now. These other countries in South America seem to be catching up. So yeah, Ecuador looks like I don't know if there's any testing going on there, but if you look at some of the reports coming out on the ground, they were one of the first countries in South America to really get hit. And you could see the events on the ground were quite ugly there, just bodies being burned in the streets and things like that. So Mexico is another one to kind of watch out for, again, just like Peru and Brazil, just kind of trending up here in this first wave. So it'll be interesting to see when these first waves kind of taper off organically without lockdowns or without, the testing and tracking, like I said, we've had in other countries. But it's interesting to see that no one's really looking at these, and they kind of just look in their own backyard and they just think, okay, the virus is over now, so it was a hoax virus or scam virus or something, without really understanding how these things occur in waves, and obviously the capacity or the potential for a virus to mutate. And if people have been locked down, for weeks or for months, then their immunity is not getting any better. And the advice, the policy coming out from governments has really been very, very low on anything in terms of like prevention. So all the stuff I talked about in the group, like vitamin C, vitamin D, uric acid, nicotine, some of these really powerful treatments that could actually flatten the curve or protect people, because you can't lock down the economy. Is definitely right. We've seen that's much worse in terms of second order effects to do that. So at some point, obviously, you have to reopen. And then when they do, you start to see, okay, what's the actual, potential here in a population that's got no immunity. So all these countries have similar problems, modern living, not getting enough sunlight. And so they're going to basically have the same issues. And because during the lockdowns, there was no focus on building natural immunity, then potentially they come out of the lockdowns with even worse immunity. And so that's what we can expect to see is, these second waves pick up in these countries when the lockdown ends. But just looking to see, obviously, South America is still well along its wave one. And yeah, like I said at the beginning, Iran is kind of ticking up again. So this is a good one, a good website, good resource to use just off Google. And this is the other one that just kind of shows the overall numbers. It doesn't really show the trends as well, but you can kind of see that Brazil shut up. They've got second highest cases now. Italy and Spain and some of these, like I said, European countries are kind of flatlined. India is really picking up as well. I've got a lot of cases there now. They're actually opening up or ending lockdowns, even though the cases are picking up there. So that's interesting that they've kind of seen it's in their view, it's not worth the second order effects of just extended lockdowns. But yeah, you can see this first wave here is just kind of taking off, and very similar to South America, no sign of a peak in sight. And obviously there's a billion plus people here. So in absolute numbers, you expect this to get much higher. So yeah, so these may be more useful countries to monitor than China or US or Europe, where there's a lot of manipulation going on. There is some obviously sort of perverse incentives to diagnose cases and deaths as COVID, especially in the US, where there's a lot of profit in the health industry. And so definitely makes the numbers less reliable there. And I've kind of posted on in the Facebook group in the numbers thread some of the excess death deltas, which I think are more useful to sort of look at. And it does show that obviously there was a clear wave of extra deaths that wasn't around in previous years. And that seems to be tapering off. But like I said, with the lockdowns lifting and no focus on natural immunity, then I think we could see obviously a second wave kind of pick up in these countries. So it's definitely not good to be complacent about or just kind of following the herd narrative. They're investing a lot of money into this vaccine programs, and so that's obviously something that they have done with a long-term view. They're expecting this virus to come back, whether organically or whether if it is engineered or released in some way, then we can kind of expect that to come back. So it's going to kind of come in waves and take people off guard again, because they're not really looking ahead of the curve or looking at other parts of the world. If you look at these kind of cases just exploding, it's pretty obvious we're not going to head back to a normal or pre-COVID era anytime soon in terms of travel or flights. What we have here now is an interesting window where obviously some countries have lifted lockdowns. So for example, Portugal, different countries in Europe you can fly into now with fairly low restrictions. So this is quite an interesting opportunity. If you were wanting to get out and you got locked down wherever you were for the first wave, you didn't really like how governments in your area, kind of reacted to it or used it as an opportunity to sort of clamp down on everything, then this is sort of your window to reevaluate, do you want to potentially still be around when the second wave comes along, if it does get worse, or if there is potentially vaccines coming along. I've talked about in the group how I think the Five Eyes countries are probably at the heart of this in terms of using this to their advantage and cracking down on freedoms of rolling out vaccines, all this kind of stuff. So that would be obviously US, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And the riots we've seen there, kind of spilling over from US now into Australia and Canada. And obviously I think we'll see the rest of the Five Eyes countries probably similar breakouts and just, really kind of nefarious agendas going on if you look into why this is happening, because people are obviously disenfranchised for a lot of reasons. They have a lot of reasons to riot, but there's also a lot to be gained by pushing these agendas. And kind of if you make everyone feel unsafe, then obviously you need the military to step in. Then you have martial law or quarantines and curfews, all those kind of things. So we're seeing it happening already now in the US, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that spread to other places. Like I said, I wouldn't want to be in a city right now for reasons of COVID or just general rioting and social unrest, especially in those Five Eyes countries and especially in the US. So if you have the ability to get out of those places, then like I said, now with this sort of lull and the lockdowns lifting in the next sort of few weeks, until these cases tick back up and they start to crack down again, then you have a sort of window where you can maybe move somewhere better. So I've talked about some locations that I like. Actually, if you look at how some countries have reacted, it also gives you some idea of how they will behave in the future. And so it's interesting that Japan seems to be relatively unscathed. They never went, crazy on the lockdowns or restricting liberties and freedoms. And such a big country, we expected them to have worse issues. I speculated why that might be in terms of, the most at-risk demographic is obviously elderly men in terms of severe COVID cases and deaths. And in the Japanese population, obviously, have a long history of smoking in that demographic that's now really old. So that's one interesting possibility that has given them some protection. But they obviously did some tracking and testing. It just wasn't as invasive, and they didn't lock down the whole economy, so they didn't have the second order sort of collapse. If you think about the general second order effects of social unrest or the chaos that can come from this type of scenario, you look at the Japanese population, they're generally very ordered, structured. They don't have these issues. It's kind of similar to Singapore in that sense. You won't see probably mass scale riots and breakdowns. So if you do want to live in sort of more urban, modern environments, just from a safety perspective or just life more being less disruptive, then yeah, Japan's an interesting one. I mean, I would probably consider it more if it was more equatorial and had sort of more sun for my biology. They have pretty seasonal weather, so it might be nice in some parts of the country in some parts of the year, but I want to be more equatorial, have more access to sun, and obviously better growing seasons and stuff. So Japan's not cheap either. You'd have to factor that into your considerations. But if you have the mobility, then that's an interesting one to look at. The way they reacted was probably how every modern government should have kind of done. Not going crazy on the fear and just kind of tracking and testing as needed. And it's interesting that they didn't just go full crazy on locking everyone down. So Thailand's another one that I think is interesting because Thailand's quite developed. If you've lived there, you've seen that obviously they have periods of sort of social unrest, but as a society, they're generally a lot more peaceful outside of those periods of massive transition and change. And during this coronavirus, there wasn't the same kind of craziness we're seeing in US. So that's an interesting place for me because obviously it's equatorial. They got really good sun. They got great locations. The other thing to consider is that if you want to be kind of away from the madness, then obviously island living tends to be a lot more remote and slower pace of life. And so again, like they're not going to have the same level of monitoring and crackdowns in these small islands that they will have in the cities and in urban areas. And just the potential for things to get out of control is less from several factors. So in Thailand, obviously you have tons of islands that are still pretty well connected, developed. Things work, things run. The fact that they have obviously the equatorial climate means that people might have better levels of vitamin D. There's still a big agriculture, sector there, so people are working outdoors more. They're not as vitamin D deficient. Obviously, in the cities like Bangkok, you might have those issues if a second wave comes along. That those people will get affected. But if you're looking to find, a place that is kind of in the middle of somewhere like Japan or somewhere like Bali, or the two ends of the extreme, then Thailand is quite interesting, and I'm looking at that as an option potentially. To base if I need to move from where I am. So right now I'm still very happy in Bali. I think the way they've reacted here obviously is again just letting people go on with their lives. Hasn't been too many restrictions. They've just quarantined a few villages and places where they thought it was going to break out. Here obviously there's a lot more people working outdoors, living outside, open air, sunshine. So the virus has had very little impact here in terms of cases and deaths. You would almost not notice it, to be honest, if you didn't hear about it on the news. So everything's still pretty much running as normal, just the tourism is way down. So obviously that's hit a lot of people in different ways. But as far as the actual impact of the virus, it's very, very low. So in my opinion, that's ideal because I want to be somewhere where people have, baseline good level of immunity. There isn't going to be a need to sort of crack down and, inject all this fear if people have low immunity and they're getting hit with the virus like you're seeing in other countries. So that's kind of what I want to avoid personally, to be stuck in that kind of situation. For me, Portugal is also quite interesting. If I had to choose somewhere in Europe, that would probably be the destination. They did have sort of a crackdown in terms of, quarantine and lockdowns. But if you look at, again, further afield, like the islands, so in Portugal, you have Azores and Madeira. I spent some time in Azores, and again, like if you're looking for a location where it's got a lot of food surplus, good growing seasons, generally chilled out people, low population density, it ticks a lot of boxes. And so again, quite developed, quite well connected to Europe. You know, maybe more culturally familiar to people who don't want to go relocate to another continent or somewhere like, you know, Thailand if they've never been there, or Japan or whatever. So obviously European culture is pretty easy for most people. But yeah, the pace of life is very slow. They have a lot of food surplus. A lot of food quality there is great. You know, a lot of dairy, traditional dairy, raised outdoors. You know, they got raw cheese. You got just a lot of really good basics there. The seafood's good there, and it's just quite an affordable, quite an easy pace of life. So if you are thinking about Europe, then those are some destinations. Also potentially Canary Islands. I spent some time there. You know, Spanish island. And again, even though Spain, the mainland was quite crazy in terms of lockdowns, if you look at the island lives, they're not as disrupted because they don't have the same level of police and, you know, control and just all the sort of craziness that you get in bigger areas, bigger populations. So I definitely look at that. I spent some time in Ligeti, and I think, yeah, Gran Canaria is an interesting island. Again, good growing seasons, good weather all year round. Potentially these islands just less disrupted. So this is just, again, looking ahead. If you know, want to get locked down somewhere, these are the places I would love to get locked down in, not have to worry about everything else that's going on around the world. But obviously, you know, across the world, you have different options. So in Australia, there's a lot of remote areas that potentially have good farmland, good communities. I can't speak to some of that because I haven't spent much time there, but it's people in the group that can talk to that. So really worth looking around based on your, you know, passport or residency, what visas you can get. Sri Lanka is another one I looked at. That's interesting because, again, you know, pretty low cost of living near the equator, so good growing seasons, good food, access to seafood. You know, this kind of stuff's going to be critical if you want to get good quality food that's decentralized in terms of supply chains. Then you want to be in places where that's just growing this stuff all year round. So this is just some second order stuff to think about. Like I said, if you are locked down in a place where you wish you weren't, and you have the opportunity to get out, then it's really worth doing some research and looking at options. It obviously helps if you've lived in those places or traveled there before. This is just stuff I'm talking about based on my experience. As far as Sri Lanka, I've never actually been there myself. I've just had pretty good intuition, pretty strong intuition that's a place that's going to do quite well. Because again, you know, just like Bali, it's an island that's fairly self-sufficient, got a lot of resources, food production, and haven't had crazy deaths or cases because probably the people are still living outdoors. With, you know, decent levels of immunity. So no massive government, you know, government's pretty low profile generally, and just not as invasive in all areas of life as you find obviously in the West. And yeah, that's some of the problems that I foresee, is that people rely so heavily on government, they forget how to live for themselves. And government can't really take care of you when there's a massive problem like this. You know, they will just take care of themselves. And that's kind of what's going on. So yeah, I talked about some of that stuff, like insiders selling off stocks and things, you know, politicians just basically looking after themselves. So definitely worth to be aware of some of this stuff, guys. As far as, you know, basic food security, I gave some tips. If you are in the US or some of these places like where they have access to co-ops, it's worth looking into, because I don't particularly want to get into farming myself or to run these kind of, you know, operations. I want to be connected to people that do it. So there's some, you know, creative ways you can have access to food security without necessarily having to do it yourself, especially with a very short runway of time to kind of figure this stuff out. You want to find people that already have, you know, kind of done a good job and got a good operation. You can kind of support them, because that's going to be more sustainable as well. So that also ties into community aspect. If you want to find people in like a local community and network to figure this stuff out, and, you know, not be totally on your own, then this is a pretty good idea to look into. So in the US, there's some good co-ops I posted about, and this is just a food security thread with some information on that. But yeah, you want to really be connected as much as possible to the food, where it's not like you in a supermarket and a bunch of middlemen in between, because that's where I think, not necessarily even in the next, you know, short term, like 3-6 months, but longer term, if there is more disruption, then these are just going to get stretched, and it's going to get harder to find good quality food. You may be able to find still the shitty packaged food you get in supermarkets anyways, right? Like the stuff that lasts on the shelves for years, but that isn't really the kind of food that I would consider wanting to live on for any length of time. So I really want to figure out where is the fresh food coming from. In Bali, it's just pretty amazing because you can get seafood delivered, you know, next day. from the ports, and they import a few things like salmon, but they have a lot of fresh stuff too. So you get, you know, oysters and all this really good quality stuff. And prices wise, it's way more affordable than the West. Portugal's pretty good too. You got pretty good seafood, like sardines are very, very cheap there. So again, they'll have the capacity to get good quality food if you need it, and not having to pay, you know, crazy amounts, or not having the risk of it being disrupted with supply chains in between you and the food. So that's some of the nice parts about Portugal, especially the islands. You know, like I said, with the dairy and Azores, it's pretty amazing. So yeah, once you've been there and you've kind of compared those options, you'll have a better idea what I'm talking about. But yeah, worth doing some research on that, guys. As far as, you know, what else has changed since the last video, let me just come to the vaccine issue again here. So I did share in the group about this, my sort of views on this. Obviously, a lot of focus is on Bill Gates and WHO, and somehow Trump, you know, defunding WHO means that he's a good guy. We're not going to get vaccinated, or we're not going to push that agenda. I think that's kind of delusional. If you look at all the money and resources being poured into this, people very closely connected to Trump, like Alan Dershowitz, saying, you know, it's you don't have a right not to be vaccinated, you know, on the record, and things like that. So I think, again, Five Eyes countries are going to push this pretty hard. It's just one reason I don't want to be anywhere near those places when they start to roll this out. You know, in the future, they may tie freedom of movement and travel to like digital immunity certificates, and having that in your passport or as part of your passport. So this is going to be an issue if you want to stay mobile in the future and move around, that you may have to find a way around that. I think humans will, you know, be able to break whatever systems humans invent. So I'm not going to go into specifics of that, because we haven't seen what solutions they're proposing. But, you know, if you do have RFID chips being included in the vaccines, and that's going to kind of track your status and if you're vaccinated or not, then I'm sure there will be hacks around that for people that still really want to travel. Personally, I'm happy just to wait and see how this plays out. I'm not in any rush to go get vaccinated just so I can jump on a plane again. I think that the vaccine is coming pretty quickly, like everything that Trump said, and the money that's been poured into this suggests that by the end of the year, there will be some kind of vaccine, whether it's tested or not, or they had it all along or not, and it's just all staged. But I think that they will be looking to vaccinate people by the end of the year. And again, I don't think it's going to be made mandatory initially, because these things are always like aborting frog syndrome. So, you know, I've shared the part 1 and 2 videos on vaccines with you guys. I suggest you look into that if you don't understand how this has been, you know, rolled out for decades, basically just gradually increasing the level of vaccines and the sort of scenarios you had to get vaccinated if you're a medical worker, if you want to put your kids in school, if you work in education, all these sort of conditions that gradually get added and added. So they just go after different groups in different states, have different, you know, schedules and laws being passed. So they'll just keep pushing. As people don't push back, then they just keep pushing. And so we've seen, obviously, the vaccine history has been, some states have been better at mobilizing and organizing and, you know, getting legislation pushed back and stalled, but in other places they've been quite sleepy. So in general, you know, the vaccination rates are pretty high across the West now, and people are pretty accepting of this as a valid way to protect communities. So if you can imagine, like I said, all this stuff about vitamin C, vitamin D, nicotine, uric acid, all this stuff's kind of being hidden from awareness. People don't know there's an option. The only options they're being presented as like hydroxychloroquine, which in my opinion is not valid long-term for immunity at all. It doesn't even remove the virus. It just stops you getting killed by it, or letting levels build up to where they become a problem. But you don't want to get stuck on a drug for the rest of your life, again, that you don't control, that you don't manufacture. It's totally out of your control. It's like giving up your sovereignty to someone and you're on medication for life. So this is a horrible alternative to a vaccine, and this is what people are being presented as, you know, the anti-vax, or the, you know, the good guy solution. So this is, in my opinion, just completely false narrative. If you're ignoring the stuff that I've shared in the group, and that policy is not being coming out from governments at all, that tells you they're not interested in really pushing out anything except a solution that they control. And obviously the vaccine is the most advanced version of that, because if they do use RFID chips or some other forms of tracking and surveillance and apps that kind of, you know, show your status of vaccination, then they can pretty much tie everything into that. They can tie in, you know, benefit payments, stimulus checks, UBI, like I said, movement of travel, getting on a plane, all these kind of things can be easily tied into that that status. So I think it's just a matter of time. I think that they'll push for, obviously, as hard as they can. They'll push to get whoever wants to be vaccinated first, and then say, look, we still need to get more because of herd immunity, and they'll just keep pushing it the same way they push other vaccines. And those vaccines, those viruses were actually not very harmful at all. So if they were able to generate so much fear around those and convince people they need to be vaccinated, then with something like COVID, potentially with a second wave that's more deadly, like I said, they've invested so much in this. I don't think they're about to give up on this. And because people are still mostly sleepy, they'll just keep pushing on that demographic. And it's only when they come up against the people that are really switched on that are not going to take it, you know, that'll be the last people they go after. Or people in America with guns who don't want to be vaccinated, you know, they're not going to go after everyone straight away and make it mandatory and give everyone a chance to kind of organize. They're going to do it very slowly, very boiling frog type of, you know, scenarios. So you can kind of see the writings on the wall if you look at some of the posts that I've shared recently from Trump himself, you know, how he was telling them to get the measles vaccine, and the amount of money he's poured in, you know, $10 billion into this Operation Warp Speed. There's just a ton of money going into this, and it's all like these DoD contracts, the military is involved. They're not going to stop. This is not something that Trump is in control of at all. He's just one of these guys on TV, like a puppet, like a talking head. And people have got so wrapped up in, you know, his ability to control the outcome. He's just an actor. It's just staged, in my opinion. And again, like outside the US, everyone's going to kind of see what the response is. If it gets successfully deployed in the US, then other governments will jump on it and they'll want to do the same. So there's no one really in those places to push back against that. There is no real organized movement. So it's really up to the people to decide what they're willing to accept. I don't really want to be involved trying to be in the middle of that with people that don't have very much awareness around health or vaccines, because most people just roll over, you know, or they're in fear of, you know, someone oppressing them. So I just don't want to put myself in that situation where I'm in that environment. I want to be somewhere where I feel empowered, where governments are not as oppressive or just not as organized in oppressing people. And, you know, you have more time to figure things out. So things are going to play out, like I said, in different phases in different parts of the world. And you just want to buy yourself as much time to see what actual technology is being pushed out. Is it an RNA vaccine? Is it a DNA vaccine? Because these next generation vaccines work very differently in the body. They're actually altering your genes to express antibodies. So you're not just got the conventional risk of vaccines that I've talked about before in those videos, which I suggest you watch. But this next generation, we don't really know what the long-term side effects of that are. There's no way they can study that for a long enough period of time, because like we've seen with conventional vaccines, some of the side effects, some of the outcomes you don't see for years or decades. So how are they going to be able to test a vaccine in 12 months and tell you it's safe? It's just complete bullshit. But that's what they're going to do, and people are going to jump on it because they're going to be scared enough. So like I said, watch for those second waves, because it tells you that it's not over yet. So, you know, as soon as people start jumping on planes and spreading around, or rioting, whatever is going on, then I think you can expect to see a pickup of cases. And one thing I posted about, which I think is worth keeping an eye on, like I said, these solar flares or these radiation spikes. So this is also tied to how viruses mutate. And this is one of the reasons that I was able to kind of warn about this before, you know, way before anyone was talking about it last year. Obviously, what's interesting is that this whole pig pandemic in China could have actually been a test run for looking at how viruses spread in these kind of conditions. There's a lot of talk of farmers complaining in China that drones were spraying stuff all over their pigs and they were catching the virus. A lot of stuff that's just not talked about, but this could easily have been just a sort of test run, like I said, to see what happens in those conditions. But yeah, I did a post here, you can see on my feed about this, that obviously there's been some flares recently. We've had one of the longest minimums with no sunspots, no activity, and now it looks like there may be some radiation coming, you know, to the Earth. So there's a previous post I did on Zika and how they studied that the outbreak of Zika was actually tied to these solar breakouts. So this one's interesting if you guys haven't seen it before, but definitely check out this post. It's a little bit slow to load, but basically they're monitoring cosmic rays, and when you had this cosmic ray spike, like a solar flare, for example, from the sun, shortly after that, like within a matter of weeks, you had this massive Zika outbreak, and this was in 2015. So this is in South America, but basically you can expect to see very similar things coming out of solar minimum. If you get, like I said, weakening magnetic field means more radiation hitting the Earth, and in that sort of context, anything that's coming from the sun or hitting the Earth is kind of amplified. And so people are not talking about this at all. But my original post on this was completely removed by Facebook and censored. So this tells you, you know, like my posts on tobacco are the only ones that seem to get deleted regularly by Facebook without any notification or warning. So there obviously is something going on here. And there's, yeah, the papers here, the research, you can read about it if you want to. We just had a flare a couple of days ago. And I think we're going to obviously get some more coming out of solar minimum because we just ended that essentially. So coming out of that dip, you start to get more activity from the sun. You still got a very weak magnetic field, and so this could be the kind of trigger or catalyst for the virus mutating organically. If it's not already, but this type of scenario is where it happens very quickly. And if people's immunity has not been adapting by being exposed outside, like I keep saying, this daily exposure outside of nature is so important to keep getting the information to your immune system to program you for the environment you're in, so it can protect you. If you're not getting that information, your body is kind of out of date. This is the software code updates you're not getting. So they want to put this into you with a vaccine to update your antibody software to protect you against future viruses, but there's just a ton of potential downsides and side effects, and you just don't control that update at all. Whereas the biology has obviously evolved, to get those updates and that immunity programming from the sun. So vitamin D is, again, just one aspect of that. You can't really get too hung up on a single biomarker like that, because again, it's shown if you supplement vitamin D without getting sunlight, you have a lot of potential negatives and side effects. So again, like trying to substitute something that's man-made for something that's got billions of years of intelligence, you're just going to fail every time. And there's a bunch of other information that's coming from the sun, a bunch of other energy, a bunch of other frequencies, that is just powers your ATP, powers your body, powers your mitochondria. So you need that information, you need that energy for your body to be strong enough, for your natural immune to be strong enough to fight whatever is coming, whatever is mutating. And this is really information that's completely being suppressed. So if you guys, are not already getting outside every day, I would suggest you take a look at this information, and it will kind of tell you that the viruses are going to be obviously mutating through this cycle. And you look at what happened with the pig pandemic, and this is just a bunch of pigs indoors, just like mammals, just like us, eating crappy food, crappy grains, cramped conditions, population density very high, low immunity, heavily vaccinated. Like all these conditions are just kind of rife for a big problem when a virus comes along that you have no vaccine for, or you have a vaccine for, but it's got other things in there. So really interested to see obviously what vaccine they come out with, what is kind of pushed as a solution. I suspect there's going to have to be obviously a lot more damage and panic or fear for people to want the vaccine or need it. So I think they keep polling people and seeing like how many Americans would take a vaccine, for example. I think right now it's less than a half. So already 50% are in such fear or such ignorance of low awareness that they're willing to jump on this. And if you can imagine the second wave coming, that's potentially much worse, that it wouldn't take much to push a lot more people over the edge. Once you have 60, 70, 80%, then you're just basically rounding up the rest, over a period of years. Like I said, this isn't going to be overnight, but this is the kind of event that, they've been waiting for, to kind of obviously crack down a lot of freedoms, push their own agendas. And so, yeah, I talk about a lot of this stuff. I'm not going to get too deep into it again. There's a really interesting film I've talked about before called In Time, which I suggest you watch, and it basically kind of spells out how you can control life. Essentially, people live for a certain amount of time, and then they get more time if they work, so time becomes the currency. And this kind of concept is where things are going. If you look at how vaccines could be basically keeping you alive for a period of time, but then the code stops working or something, switches if you don't pay your bills or whatever. So I definitely suggest watching this film, because it's got a lot of interesting information. They don't obviously talk about vaccines directly, but you can see how the technology being pushed in next generation vaccines could be easily tied into something like this in the future. And it's just a really good movie, because helps you see where things are going. So that, this scene's interesting because they talk about this evolution, natural selection, and Darwinian capitalism. So it's basically the rich obviously get to live forever, and there's TV series like Altered Carbon that talk about that as well. But this is really just a glimpse into how people imagine the future to be. And obviously, if you can control life and lifespan, then you get to say who lives and who dies. And it's always been about that inequality of access. And everyone's got access to the sun. But if you tell people, sunlight's dangerous and you have to get a vaccine to be healthy, then you can very easily convince people that, this is the direction things are going to go in. So it's a really good movie. I suggest watching that, and Altered Carbon as well. And yeah, I've done a lot of posts in the group on vaccines in those videos, so definitely check them out. I think this is quite relevant to where things are going. And like I said, I'm trying to stay ahead of the curve on this, look where things might be in 6-12 months. So I talked about food security and talked about vaccines. I think in terms of the science, we haven't seen much new stuff come out since the previous videos I did on like the receptors and everything that's being targeted by the virus. So definitely go through that and make yourself familiar with that if you're not sure about that. Seems like diabetes is a bigger risk than people understood as well from some of the stuff I'm reading. So making sure you have good blood sugar and obviously your diet's in check, you're active every day. You know, just basic awareness around your health is really important. That's why I tell them to track their biomarkers, and I have that longevity group because it really helps you see issues before they become diseases. And once they're chronic diseases, they're obviously a lot harder to manage. So these are all the kind of outcomes that the virus is speeding up. If you look at who it's affected the most, it's the most vitamin D deficient, the people with the worst hypertension, the worst cardiovascular disease, you know, the worst blood sugar and diabetes. The people have basically lost control of their bodies already. They're already kind of, you know, with low awareness, they've you know, kind of fallen prey to the matrix traps, and they rely on medication. They don't understand the effects of junk light and blue light EMFs on blood sugar, and obviously the effects of diet and things that make it worse. But this virus is basically speeding up the outcome from those choices. So if you're making good choices and you have good vitamin D, then there's very little sort of downsides from this virus in the short term. And the bigger risk is obviously the vaccine that they'll push. But in terms of keeping yourself healthy, then this is just the basic things to be aware of. Yeah, keeping active, keeping out in the sun, those things all help vitamin D and blood sugar. And if you're highly vitamin D deficient, there's a high chance you have blood sugar issues. That's why everyone's going keto, right? They want to try and lose weight because they're indoors, they're not getting any vitamin D, they're not moving, so they can't afford carbs. It seems like carbs is the enemy, but actually carbs is essential for glycogen, for hormones, for so many things. So again, I'm not going to rant too much on this stuff because I talk about this stuff in the longevity group and I've posted a lot over the years, but this is all kind of tied together. If you understand the at-risk demographics here, is the people that basically lost control of their bodies, their biological bank accounts a while ago. And you see the future of medicine is basically how you can control life, you know, with code. So this is, in my opinion, very relevant to the DNA vaccines, the technology, if you look into some of how that works, because you don't control the code. So whoever's controlling that gets to decide, like I said, how long that code works for. So yeah, definitely take a look at that, guys. Quite interesting. I'll be back soon with another video. Cheers.